Aaron, it's really good to have you to talk about higher ed today. When big issues in higher education come to mind for me, I know that there are a lot of folks in big positions. First number they call is Aaron Andersen. They say, how can we think through this a little bit better? And so really excited to have you to talk about some of those big issues that higher education institutions are facing today. Let's talk a little bit first. Let's introduce who you are.
Sure.
And a bit about your background.
Yeah. So Aaron Andersen, senior partner here at Cicero. I've been here a very long time, over a decade now, and for that period of time, I've led our work with higher education institutions and systems, and very proud over the course of that time to have partnered with just a whole range of different institutions and systems and types of post-secondary credentialing bodies across the whole landscape of higher education in the United States. I'm very proud of the work that we've done there. Before that, I actually came from sort of what we call the academy. I came from higher education. So my career prior to Cicero was actually working at institutions of higher education, helping them do a whole range of things to improve the ways that they better serve students and find ways to operate more efficiently and so on.
Well, and so, with that background, it kind of leads us to what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about enrollment operations, some of the challenges that you're seeing with enrollment, and let's just dive right in. We're going to have a good long discussion. What does the landscape look like right now for enrollment?
It's an interesting question, and these are unique times, really unprecedented in really the modern history of higher education in this country. There are a lot of things sort of lining up, and I guess I should start by saying, it's a unique time because most institutions are still sort of coming out of kind of the reaction to the pandemic and COVID and everything else. They're emerging from that. And I want to make sure we note that, but I'm going to hold that aside for a moment because we're in the middle of something I think that is even larger. There are sort of an array of things that are happening in the higher ed landscape right now that we just haven't seen before. Some of them I think folks, plenty of folks know about. Others I think are sort of lurking, you might say, or are on the horizon. And I think it's important to maybe talk about the ways that these different things are starting to shape together to create, I don't want to call it a perfect storm. I'm not a doomsayer when it comes to higher education, but there are a variety of things that are causing some fairly monumental shifts and will continue to cause those shifts going forward. So what are some of those things? First, and a lot of ink has been spent on this already, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it, but one thing that most folks are aware of is the demographic cliff.
Yeah.
That is either here, depending on sort of where you live in the United States, or it's looming, right? And what we mean by that is that, quite simply, the number of traditional age college-going students really for the first time in decades, in more than a century, is starting to decline. And you can understand that would have a profound impact on institutions that sort of depend on students showing up at their front door to be able to continue to sort of do what they do, right? Its effects are already being seen in the Northeast, but it's expected really across the country. There are very few places that will be immune from that trend. But that's just one of many, right? So you've got sort of that happening. You've got declining public trust in higher education, really for the first time at least since it's really been measured,
Which
right?
is really interesting.
Yeah. And there's a variety of factors that are probably contributing to that sort of exist at the societal level. And we don't need to go deep onto those factors, but it's happening, right?
Right.
And what's interesting is you've got some declining public trust for a variety of factors, but at the same time, the data bears out that the value of a post-secondary education, the value of a post-secondary credential is as important to an individual's economic, personal, the variety of ways that you could measure success and importance of something, that credential is as important as ever. The data bears this out, right? Others have done the work. We do the work all the time. We capture that data, we analyze it, and it's as valuable, if not more valuable than ever. And yet, the public sort of sees it differently. The market is reacting differently and thinks differently about higher education now. So you've got that, right? And then you've got the type of student that is seeking post-secondary education is really shifting as well, right? You've got a much larger share of folks that are, again, showing up at the doorstep that are adult students that are seeking something that might look a little different from the experience and the outcome of higher education than, sort of your traditional age 17-year-old that's sort of, the way that we normally would frame those things, right? And that's happening every year over year, right? So you've got that happening in the background. At the same time, you've got this decades-long trend, at least for public institutions, where they're receiving a little less money each year from their state legislatures. So they're becoming more and more dependent on tuition revenue and revenue from other sources. All of these things are sort of swirling in a bit of a stew right now, and combined with lots of other factors that I haven't mentioned, that are really leading to a set of really interesting circumstances for institutions. And I suppose the big picture of this is that, you asked for the big picture on enrollment trends. The big picture here is that a lot of institutions, and quite frankly systems, have been caught really flat-footed by a lot of this, right? Institutions are big organizations. It's hard to be nimble when you're large like that. It's hard to be nimble in the face of sort of threats from lots of different angles or changes from lots of different angles. And so this flat-footedness has really led, from an enrollment perspective, what we're seeing is lots and lots of institutions and even systems leaning on sort of short-term fixes, Band-Aids, if you will. Getting from one enrollment cycle to the next. We've got pressure to grow, we're dependent on tuition revenue, but we've got a population that's diminishing here and that's changing there. We've got fewer dollars here. And so these short-term fixes become something that are becoming more and more dependent on. And that's just not it's candidly, it's not a sustainable thing, but we're seeing an awful lot of institutions sort of getting stuck in that trap, as it were. This expected thing, this notion that, well, there's always going to be a population if I'm, the head of an institution, or if I'm looking at it more broadly, a set of institutions or something. I've always been able to count on, well, our audience, our market is always just going to continue growing, but it hasn't, right? The demographic cliff has been pretty pronounced. Birth rates decline pretty precipitously, and along with that, you project forward 18 years, and you have what we're seeing today, which is smaller populations of traditional age college-going students. And again, first place we're seeing that is the Northeast. That's the first place where the sort of birth rates went into decline a couple decades ago, and now the impacts are really being felt across institutions there. You asked how institutions ought to think about that and what they ought to be doing about it. Well, goodness, right? The biggest picture thing is you just can't take for granted anymore that, of course, we're going to have an audience, right? Not only is the audience declining, but you've got now, other institutions, whether it's regionally or in terms of an area that you specialize in or whatever else, you could always think of them as friendly competitors, right? Because, well, they're drawing from this population, so are we. But there are enough seats at the table. Well, suddenly there aren't enough seats at the table. It's a real phenomenon, right? And what that has meant and continues to mean is that if I'm leading an institution in any meaningful way, I need to be aware that this is either here now or it's coming, and plenty of people have been talking about it for years now. But the impact is, I can't just say, well, let's hope for the best. Let's keep doing what we've always done. Let's continue to build our structures around this notion that we can go out and recruit 17-year-old students from the area or from our traditional recruiting pool and expect success. That's just not going to be the case anymore.
Well, and I think that if things are going to be shifting so much, and if folks that are in a leadership position are going to have to really rethink about how they're approaching bringing in new students, what would you say is you're starting to talk to these leaders about how they can potentially think about it, let alone actually implement and improve over time? How do you introduce talking to leadership folks about how they can begin to think about addressing this issue?
Yeah, I mean, the time to start thinking about addressing this issue was a decade ago, right?
Okay.
Now, I mean, for the most part, we're reacting to it now. It's the time for careful, thoughtful planning around who we are and what we need to be. The best time to do that was a decade ago. The next best time is immediately right now, right? That's not to say, again, that sounds a little bit more pessimistic than I ought to, because there are still plenty of things that an institution can and should be doing. But the time for sort of careful, thoughtful, typical sort of higher ed, let's take a couple of years and assign some committees and task forces to study the issue. That moment is past for a lot of institutions, right? I mean, we're seeing, very tragically, we're seeing institutions closing their doors today. That's not something that you would expect or
higher
that you
ed,
traditionally
you're seeing
see, right?
institutions
Sure.
just actually close. That's a I'd say from a perception, you would never have guessed that universities are actively shutting down.
You wouldn't guess
across the
it,
country,
but there's
right?
also something sort of hidden beneath those. Those closures make the headlines, but behind those headlines, for every institution today that is actually having to, again, sadly having to close their doors, there are 100 others that are swallowing hard in the back rooms and saying, what additional band-aids do we need to put on to make it, they might not say to make it, but to sort of get to the next enrollment cycle and figure some of these things out. And we understand that's hard. And I've been in those conversations, and they're difficult conversations. I suppose my point is that there are things that institutions ought to be doing with great urgency. And this is not just applicable to the institutions that are under real threat. That are looking at the prospect of something as significant as a closure in the next 3 to 5 years. It really applies to a lot of institutions. And what I'd suggest there is to start to get really thoughtful about the kinds of innovations you've got to put in place tomorrow.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah.
Let's talk about some of the innovations you've been working with. You've been working with these leaders, like you said, in these really hard conversations. So those institutions that are able to start making those steps, what are some things that they can start to think about and do?
Yeah, I mean, look, I might even take a half step back before I get to your question, Chase, because I fear that I'm sounding a little pessimistic. I think there's a lot that can be done to stem these tides and to do a lot of good. There are pockets of innovation everywhere, and we're seeing it, and we're really heartened to see thoughtful leadership trying to address these things in ways that don't involve just buying more boxes of Band-Aids, right? And so I want to say that because we're seeing a lot of really important reasons to be hopeful that the ship can be put back on course, as it were. But having said that, I think there are a variety of things that we see in common to smart institutions that are being thoughtful, either in planning and preparing for the whole array of things that are sort of happening in the landscape around them, or with a more imminent threat, that they're addressing those things as well. A handful of things come to mind.
Okay.
I had a favorite professor in graduate school who used to repeat to us over and over, almost every class. He'd say, if I leave you with nothing else, know your rules and follow them.
That's good.
I want, this was sort of preparing future university leaders and things, and he really pounded that home. I'm going to adapt that a little bit and say that the institutions that are going to be successful in sort of navigating this sort of perilous landscape, they need to know their institutions and let their institutions lead. So what do I mean by that? Gosh, we've got a landscape of hundreds, if not thousands, of institutions in the United States. That the trend for decades now has been, we need to try to become everything to everyone. We need to offer everything to every possible person who can step through these doors. That's a noble ambition, but what it's led to is an array of challenges for institutions today, right? You can think about this in terms of we've added a whole bunch of stuff that we can't really support anymore. And you've got to really have the hard conversation, look internally and say, who are we? What are we best equipped to do? Who are the populations we're best equipped to serve? Answering those questions, really knowing who you are as an institution, will allow you to create or build upon a strategy that's going to carry you through this, right? Too many institutions are stuck in this, we talk about it sometimes with our institutional partners, in the sea of sameness, right? Everybody became the same thing. And that's problematic, like I said, for a variety of reasons. But the institutions that are starting to sort of distinguish themselves, large or small or anything in between, in this landscape, are the ones that have gotten to a place where they're really thoughtful about, look, this is who we are. this is what we're really good at, and we're going to focus on that. We're going to be the best version of that thing, right? As opposed to trying to be the best version of everything for everyone. That's the first piece.
A very challenging thing, I think, for a lot of institutions to know who they are.
Sure.
And that expertise is challenging. It's a hard question to ask. So let's say, okay, we've got institutions, they're like, yeah, I know who I am. I've still got this problem. I've still got these challenges. I mean, what else are you seeing as effective?
Sure, right. And you're right to say that's a hard thing, right? It's a hard, you've got to sort of swallow hard and say, who are we, right? Because a variety of different influences and pressures over many decades now have led most institutions to believe that who they are ought to be everything, right? And this is a pivot from that, but it's probably a necessary pivot. The second thing, and it really follows from the first, the second thing in that sort of that handful of things that if when I'm in these conversations that I suggest, or if I were leading an institution that I would pay attention to, is to be really thoughtful about what my brand is, right? Instead of just looking inward at the institution saying who we are, I need to understand how the market perceives my institution. What are we uniquely positioned to deliver to students, to communities, to states, to the country, right? What do we offer? And there comes with that a caveat, because every CMO of every institution that we've ever had the pleasure of working with says, well, how do I say something about us that makes us truly unique? And the reality is that's really difficult to do. Again, there are a lot of institutions that deliver very similar things. And so my response to that is not always, you don't have to come up with just do it. You don't have to come up with that, like the one thing that's going to, sort of separate you from the market. What you do have to be really good at is understanding your brand, your value propositions, how the market values those things, and then communicate that. Full stop, right? So often you're caught up in trying to look for a creative way to differentiate that has little to do with who you are, or a unique way to say. And the reality is that successful institutions, they know who they are, they understand how that translates to the market, and that's the brand that they bring to market, right? That's I'm making it sound simple. That's a very difficult thing. Often it requires, extensive sort of research or understanding into the market, lots of years of paying close attention to those sorts of things, and then thoughtful brand building, thoughtful value proposition articulation, and so on. But if you can do that right, it makes a meaningful difference.
Well, and I could see how as an educator, you might even bristle a little bit at the idea of defining brand for education,
Sure.
Right? I can see how you could easily get even concerned at the idea of considering your offering to knowledge as a brand, right?
That's exactly right. And look, higher ed institutions historically have bristled even at talking about things in terms of the market, or referring to folks as customers or something. And that's fine. I don't need to get into the semantics of the debate necessarily, other than just to say the reality is you are serving a market. And the folks that populate that market are, in fact, customers. They are consumers of the product that you're selling. Full stop, right? And it's not. It's a little bit uncouth still to talk about it in those terms, but that's the reality. And I think the sooner that institutions can sort of orient themselves to acknowledge that that's the landscape in which they are operating, the better off they'll be, right? The next piece, it's sort of in terms of the handful of things that come to mind in terms of what do you do, is another extension from there. Find your audience, understand who they are, understand how you can best serve them. Right? Again, this goes hand in hand with sort of that we're going to build something that is everything to everyone. Well, the everyone part is something that I think a lot of institutions got really accustomed to sort of seeking. Right? Well, who do we serve as an institute? Everybody, right? And this is not me saying you shouldn't, depending on your institutional mission and structure and purpose and so on, that you shouldn't try to serve as many folks as you can. I'm talking more about you're spending real dollars going out and marketing to folks, recruiting them, spending real dollars trying to bring them to your institution. When you're investing those dollars, you better be pretty darn sure today that you are investing in marketing to recruiting, working to enroll students who are a good fit for your institution, who are going to be receptive to those first two sort of things that I mentioned, right? Who you are and what you can offer them. And too often institutions are still just kind of tossing bowls of spaghetti at the wall when it comes to, we need more dollars for recruiting and marketing. We need to, because we've got to go out and that continues to work for some institutions. But there comes a point where lots of institutions are finding today that's no longer sustainable. We can't just go out there and try to find everybody everywhere. Coming to understand the students that are the best fit, that are going to be most receptive to what you can offer. That, again, I'm making it sound simpler than it is. This is hard work.
No, it sounds very, I could see trying to
critical.
even have the conversation would be very challenging.
Sure.
I mean, it does start to cascade after itself with that core of just even understanding who you are. Then creating something that is reflective of that and how you're presenting, right, to the world. Yeah. And then even from there now, talking about really appealing to the persons that's going to most navigate to your core.
That's right.
Right.
That's right. That's right. Look, there's just, quite candidly, there are a lot of dollars wasted in every enrollment cycle by almost every institution out there pursuing populations of students that will never listen.
So that's interesting. Talk about that a little bit. Talk about millions of dollars being spent. You're talking to somebody, and honestly, that prospective student not even going to listen.
I'll reference, this is painted with a broad brush, but I'll let you give an example. It references my own experience, right? When I was a sophomore in high school, and this is many, many years ago, but when I was a sophomore in high school, I took the PSAT. The PSAT, I did well enough that my scores got received by a whole bunch of schools all across the country because they paid to receive my contact information on the basis of the score that I got, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I started getting brochures in the mail. And I kept a box under my bed, and
I think everybody's gotten the brochures.
Right? Yeah. My folks would laugh because I took it as a point of pride that I was, I overflowed my first box and I got a second box, and I look at these brochures and go, I've never heard of this place. I've never heard of the town in this different part of the country that this place is in. And I open the brochure and see some really expensive looking photographs of students laughing and having a good time. But nothing about what I saw there told me anything about why that was a good fit for me. And it was probably a wasted cause in the first place, right? Mm. I'm oversimplifying, but that continues today, right? Less with brochures. Now it's digital marketing spend. It's recruiters. It's on, and the point is, this goes on. And it's because this is sort of the way that we do and have always done things. Innovative, smart institutions have started to move beyond this, but a lot of institutions are stuck in this sort of this cycle of we've just got to widen the funnel at the top, and that means going after everybody. And the reality is with limited dollars, that's getting harder and harder to do, especially when everybody else is competing for those same eyeballs. It's tricky. Coming to understand the students that you can better hone in on and target takes real investment. It takes real thoughtful, research and analytics and a variety of things. But done right, you'll spend less ultimately and get better yield from that, and enrollment numbers will grow. We've seen it.
Hmm. So, Aaron, focusing on these folks in particular, your most likely students that are going to enter into your school,
sure,
to your institution. Talk to me a little bit about the operational side of it. Talk to me about inquiry to enrollment and
this is an area, Chase, where you can have almost immediate impact if you're an institution. Most institutions, they sort of operate on the model that, famously, John Kirkland, president of Harvard University, 200 years ago said, every tub on its own bottom. And you got a lot of tubs at every university, right? As an operating model that encourages growth, innovation, self-sufficiency, and so on, but you've got a lot of different tubs, even in just that inquiry to enrollment process. You've got marketing, and you've got recruiting, and you've got admissions. But that's not where it stops, right? Because someone gets admitted, and then it's financial aid, and it's transcripts, and it's orientation, and it's advising, and it's a whole range of different things. And most of these different departments they might have a common leader, but they all function independently. One of the things that we found is that for all of the attempts to sort of make the process, quote unquote, seamless for prospective students, from the moment that they first get interested all the way to the moment that they show up on campus, the reality is most institutions are wasting a lot of time. They're wasting a lot of money, and they're losing a lot of students that would otherwise have been interested because their operations aren't aligned with student needs, preferences. They are cumbersome. They're difficult to navigate. There are lots of handoffs. There's a whole variety of different things, and it's difficult for institutions to see that because each one of these different groups, well, we've got an important function. Yes, they do, but zoomed out, the sort of the combination of all these things working or sometimes not working together can lead to real problems. One of the areas that we've seen is that institutions that get really serious about improving their inquiry through enrollment operations is that they can find immediate gains. Fewer students are becoming frustrated with the process. Fewer dollars are going out into the void, never to be seen again. And they're able to see real, meaningful, and sustainable enrollment gains year over year when they just fix that sort of side of the shop. It's an important one.
Aaron, so you've talked about the myriad challenges going from the initiation, the inquiry, to the enrollment. Let's talk a little bit about, okay, they're on campus.
Yeah.
What about post-enrollment?
Yeah. I mean, look, this all is the tip of the iceberg, right? And we're talking about this because enrollment is so prevalent in the minds of so many institutions because it's problematic, right?
Yeah.
But this is not lost on anyone that spent any time in higher education. Everyone knows that it costs less to retain a student than it does to recruit a student. And yet, institutions still struggle meaningfully to engage with students once they're there, to provide them the resources and needs that the students really are seeking, to connect with them just in time with the things they're looking for, to help them identify their purpose in being there and helping them get to that purpose. They struggle with that, right? And there are lots of ways to sort of meaningfully address that. We see lots of good ideas out there. But a lot of institutions, again, the approach has been typically, we just need to throw more resources into the mix. And then it becomes, it's the same sort of thing as when we talk with institutions about their brand messaging, we say if you've got 10 messages, you have no message, right? You need a focused message.
For sure.
The same thing sort of happens with sort of this resource stew for students. If you tell them we've got 300 different offices that are set up to help you, it's bewildering. How do I? Which one is the?
And then they don't even
access any of them. And so finding ways to meaningfully connect with student needs is one part of that. Another is just that we talked about inquiry to enrollment operations, but the operational side of the university also there are lots of different ways that there are meaningful disconnects that need not exist, whether it's between academic departments or academic and operational departments, administrative departments. There are also ways that they're spending more dollars than they need to there, which has a real impact, right? It's more complicated than this, but at its core, the more dollars you're spending on administrative expenses year over year, and most of those are overhead, most of those have to repeat. If you're not thinking hard about that, then when it comes time to figure out what to do about the fact that we were down in enrollment last year, you've got to figure out a way to make the money, right? And that means tuition increases. Finding ways to operate more effectively and efficiently, less dollars going into the administrative budget, or at least justifiable dollars going to that budget, means that you're going to have a better opportunity to serve more students because you don't have to ratchet tuition up year over year every single year. So a lot in play there, and certainly worth more exploration than we've got time for here. But there's a whole range of things that smart institutions really are and should be thinking about to navigate these interesting times we're in.
Well, I mean, I think to your point of, it just does feel so much like it's complicated, it's nuanced, it's going to vary by every single institution. And I think that, really, it just does sound beneficial that as things are shifting so rapidly, that there's a lot of questions, a lot of answers that need to be discussed and sussed out. And let's talk more on this another time.
Love to.
There's a lot to go over. I'm sure we'll get some questions as well. But Aaron, thanks for joining. Thanks for talking today.
Chase, thank you.
All right.
Real pleasure.
Thanks, Aaron.